The rain came down without warning. The way disasters always do, not with a trumpet blast or a slow gathering of clouds, but all at once. A curtain dropped from the sky, erasing the lane markings and turning the highway into a black mirror that reflected nothing useful. Ethan Carter drove with both hands on the wheel, the kind of grip a man uses when he is holding himself together, rather than merely steering a vehicle. His cardboard box sat on the passenger seat. Inside it, a coffee mug with a chipped handle, a wristwatch that had stopped working 2 years ago and that he had never found time to fix, and a commendation plaque whose corners had bent from being knocked off a shelf too many times. He had put the plaque in the box last, after everything else, and had held it for a moment before setting it down, not with sentimentality, but with the recognition that it was the only thing in the box that had a date on it, and that the date was 14 years ago, and that the distance between that date and this one was the shape of something it was too early to name. 14 years. That was the number that kept repeating in his skull, not with anguish exactly, but with the flat, toneless quality of a fact that refuses to stop being true. 14 years in that building. 14 years of arriving before anyone else and leaving after the lights in most offices had already gone dark. He had not gone looking for trouble at Meridian Logistics. He had gone looking for work. The way a 38-year-old man with a daughter to feed and a mortgage that did not care about his feelings went looking for work with his head down and his hands ready. His daughter Mia had been 2 years old when her mother left, which was a story Ethan had told himself so many times, in so many different framings, that it had lost most of its edge and become simply a fact about the shape of his life, the way a scar loses its heat and becomes only geography. He had built their life with the materials available: a small house in a decent school district, a reliable routine, dinners at the table rather than in front of the television, because he had read somewhere that it mattered and had decided to believe it. He had been the kind of father who showed up for school plays, for parent-teacher conferences, for the 2:30 in the morning fevers that arrived without notice and required someone to be there. And he was always there, because that was the architecture of the life he had chosen to build after the one he had expected fell apart. He had started in the maintenance bay, diagnosing conveyor faults and hydraulic failures, and he had been good at it. Not flashy good, not the kind of good that got you mentioned in company newsletters, but the kind of good that meant the machines kept running, and the shipments kept moving, and nobody had to call an emergency repair crew at 3 in the morning. Over the years, he had developed a reputation among the floor workers as the man you called when something mattered. His number was in the phones of people whose names never appeared on any org chart, people who knew that Ethan Carter would answer and that he would not make them feel stupid for asking. That reputation had never translated into a promotion, a raise beyond the standard annual percentage, or a single invitation to the executive dining room on the 14th floor. He had made his peace with that, or he had told himself he had, which is a different thing entirely. Victor Hale arrived 18 months ago with a new title, a new philosophy, and a new way of looking at long-tenured employees that reminded Ethan of the way a man looks at furniture he is planning to sell. Victor believed in efficiency, which in his vocabulary meant cost reduction, which in practice meant replacing people who had been around long enough to earn decent wages with newer, cheaper versions of the same labor. He dressed well, spoke in the cadences of a business school commencement address, and had a talent for making cruelty sound like strategy. The floor workers noticed the change in the building's atmosphere before the executives did. They came to Ethan in the break room, in the elevator, in the parking garage, speaking in lowered voices about overtime being cut and safety protocols being quietly revised downward. Ethan listened, and then Ethan did what Ethan always did. He went and looked at the actual machinery. What he found was not ambiguous. A batch of conveyor belt couplings, sourced from a new, cheaper supplier, showed hairline fractures under stress, testing that the original supplier's parts would not have shown. The load-bearing tolerances were documented in the engineering specifications that Victor's procurement team had apparently not read or had read and chosen to ignore. Ethan wrote it up. He put the measurements, the test results, and the projected failure rates into a formal report and submitted it through the ethics reporting channel, which was the channel the company handbook said existed for exactly this purpose. His direct supervisor, a pleasant man named Gary, who had begun arriving at work with the expression of someone perpetually anticipating bad weather, told him quietly that he should think carefully about what he was doing. Another engineer, a woman named Dana, who had worked at Meridian almost as long as Ethan, put it more plainly, "Don't do this. Victor doesn't forget." Ethan thanked them both and submitted the report anyway. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Then Victor Hale's assistant called to say that Victor would like to see him. The office on the 14th floor had a view of the city that Ethan had never seen before, because he had never had a reason to be on the 14th floor. He noticed it briefly, the geometry of streets and buildings laid out below, like a diagram of something important, and then he stopped noticing it, because Victor was looking at him with an expression that contained no warmth whatsoever. And everything Ethan needed to understand about how this meeting was going to go. Victor did not raise his voice. Men like Victor rarely needed to. He spoke in the measured, even tone of someone explaining an unpleasant but inevitable policy. And the words he used were words that had been chosen carefully for their plausible deniability. He said that Ethan demonstrated insufficient collaborative spirit. He said that Ethan's approach to workplace culture was not aligned with the direction the company was moving in. He said that the organization needed people who could adapt, and that this decision had been a long while coming, and that HR would walk him through the severance package, which was, Victor said, more than generous given the circumstances. Ethan asked about the safety report. Victor smiled, the kind of smile that lives entirely on the surface of a face, and said that the company's internal review had found no actionable concerns. Then he called for the HR representative, who was already waiting outside the door, because this meeting had been choreographed from the beginning. The HR representative was efficient and spoke without making eye contact. She produced the paperwork with the practiced fluency of someone who had done this many times. She explained the terms. She extended her hand for Ethan's badge. He unpinned it from his shirt and set it on the desk with a quietness that felt, to him, like the only form of dignity available. He gathered his things from his desk in the box that someone had already provided, which told him the box had been part of the plan too. He passed through the open plan office, where 22 people he had worked alongside for years sat at their desks and kept their eyes on their screens, not because they did not care, but because caring and looking were two different risks, and only one of them was safe. The security guard who walked him to the elevator was a young man named Marcus, who had asked Ethan to explain an electrical fault in his car 2 months ago. Marcus said nothing. His face said that he was sorry. Outside the building, the rain that had been threatening all morning arrived without further hesitation, and Ethan stood at the curb for a moment with his cardboard box and the specific silence of a man who has just watched a large portion of his life close a door behind him. He drove. He did not have a destination. He had a direction, which was home. But home was 30 minutes away on a highway that was now running slow because of the weather, and the slowness was almost a relief because it gave the shock somewhere to go. He passed the industrial district where Meridian's eastern warehouse sat behind its chain-link fence, and he thought about the conveyor couplings, and he thought about the report that had been filed and buried, and he thought about the warehouse workers who ran those lines every day without knowing what was holding the machinery together. Then the traffic slowed further, and through the rain and the brake lights ahead of him, he saw why. On the shoulder of the highway, tilted at the wrong angle against the concrete barrier, a black SUV sat with its passenger side crushed inward from an impact with something the barrier, another vehicle. A moment of hydroplaning and smoke was rising from under the hood, with the particular urgency of smoke that has not yet decided what it is going to become. Ethan pulled over without deciding to pull over. It was the kind of decision that happens in the body before the mind has been consulted. He was out of his car and moving toward the wreck through the rain before he had formed a single conscious thought about what he was going to do. Behind him, on the highway, half a dozen cars had slowed to watch. Several people were standing outside their vehicles with phones raised. The smoke thickened. The driver's window was intact, but the door was jammed. Ethan moved to the rear, where the frame was less compromised, and he picked up the tire iron from his own trunk. He had gone back for it, without realizing he'd made the decision to go back, and he used it against the rear passenger window, the way a man uses a tool, when the tool is the only thing standing between an outcome that is acceptable and one that is not, the glass went. He cleared the frame with his elbow, working methodically around the edges the way someone trained to work with broken things knows to do, not frantically, but with the calibrated efficiency of a person whose relationship with machinery has taught him that panic is a form of imprecision, and that imprecision, at the wrong moment, has consequences. Inside, in the front seat, a woman was conscious but pinned. Her seatbelt locked. The dashboard pushed closer to her than the designer had ever intended. She was looking at him with an expression that was not panic. Panic had apparently given way to a kind of focused, precise attention, the look of someone who has decided to be present for whatever comes next. He reached across her and found the seatbelt release with his fingers rather than his eyes. Because there was smoke coming through the vents now, and the smell had changed from hot metal to something that lived closer to ignition. The latch released. He got his arm under her shoulder and she helped, her feet finding purchase, her body understanding what was needed even before her mind could have articulated it. They came out through the rear window together, his feet on the wet asphalt, her weight against him, and they were perhaps 12 steps from the vehicle when the engine compartment lit in a way that turned the rain around the car into orange and white. He kept moving. He got her behind the barrier. He put his jacket around her because she was shaking, and the rain was not warm. And he knelt on the wet concrete and looked at her face to see what needed to be done next. She was bleeding from a cut above her eyebrow, a clean laceration that looked worse than it was. Her left wrist was cradled against her chest. She was wearing clothes that cost more than Ethan's monthly car payment. And her wrist carried a bracelet that caught the orange light of the burning vehicle in a way that confirmed certain things about her circumstances. She looked at him with that same quality of clear, present attention. She tried to form a question. He said, "You're safe. Don't move." Then she tried again, and he understood she was asking his name. He said only, "You're safe." Somewhere behind them, running feet, men in dark suits, moving fast from vehicles that had appeared further down the shoulder, vehicles that had apparently been following the SUV, which meant that what had appeared to be a single woman in a car was, in fact, a woman with a security detail, and that the detail had been helpless to do what a man with a tire iron and no hesitation had managed to do in under 2 minutes. The ambulance arrived. Ethan answered a paramedic's questions briefly and accurately. By the time the first police officer made his way through the stopped traffic to where Ethan stood, Ethan was already moving back toward his own car. He did not leave because he was afraid of scrutiny. He left because there was nothing left to be done, and because standing around waiting to be thanked was not something he had ever been able to do with any comfort. He drove home in the rain with the passenger window of his mind full of the woman's face, that quality of absolute attention, the bracelet catching fire-colored light, and then he pulled into his driveway and went inside and made himself eat something, because his daughter would be home from school in 2 hours, and she would need dinner, and a father who had his hands around the situation. The email arrived the next morning, which was a Thursday. The subject line read, "Final administrative processing required attendance." The body of the email informed him, in the clipped language of corporate legal departments, that he was required to return to Meridian Logistics headquarters to complete his separation documentation. The email had been sent at 6:47 in the morning by a woman in HR whose name Ethan did not recognize, which meant she was someone hired recently, after the cull that Victor Hale had been conducting in slow motion for months. Ethan read the email at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow and the morning light coming through the window at the low, ungenerous angle of autumn, and he sat with it long enough to understand that he had a choice. He could ignore it, or he could go. Ignoring it had legal and financial implications that he could not afford, given the mortgage in his daughter's college fund, and the fact that his next paycheck was going to be the last one for a while. He went. The lobby of the Meridian building was familiar in the way that a place you have been forced to leave becomes immediately, aggressively familiar, every detail sharpened by the consciousness that you no longer belong there. The security desk guard scanned Ethan's visitor badge with professional neutrality. In the elevator, 2 junior analysts who had started at the company within the last year stood close to one wall and did not speak. On the 7th floor, where HR was located, Ethan waited in a chair outside an office while people walked past him with the deliberate non-acknowledgement of colleagues who know something uncomfortable has happened and are managing their discomfort by pretending he is not there. A woman named Sandra, who had worked in the HR department for 11 years and whom Ethan had once helped navigate a parking garage mechanical issue on a Saturday morning, walked past him twice without making eye contact. He understood. He did not hold it against her. He was shown into a conference room where a young HR associate named Patrick sat with a folder and an expression of careful professional sympathy. Patrick explained that the final processing included a document that Ethan needed to review. The document, which was 3 pages and had been drafted by the legal department, was an agreement in which Ethan acknowledged full professional responsibility for certain maintenance decisions that had led to what the document described as operational inefficiencies, and in which Ethan further agreed not to discuss the company's internal safety protocols with any external party. Ethan read all 3 pages. He read them slowly. The way he had always read technical specifications, looking for the places where the language was doing work it did not want to announce. He set the document down. He said he would not be signing it. Patrick blinked. Ethan explained, in simple and direct language, that the document asked him to accept responsibility for decisions he had not made, and to suppress information about safety conditions that he had, in fact, formally reported. He said this without heat, because heat would have given the situation a texture that could be managed. He said it the way an engineer describes a failed component. Here is what happened. Here is what it means. Here is why the proposed solution does not address the actual problem. Victor Hale appeared in the doorway of the conference room 15 minutes later. He had been told, apparently, that there was a complication. His expression had the quality of a man who has rarely encountered complications that persisted longer than the time it took him to express displeasure. He looked at Ethan the way he had looked at him the day before as furniture, but today there was something else underneath it. An edge of something that might have been, in a different man, shame. Victor said that Ethan was being difficult. Victor said that Ethan was trying to damage the company over a personal grievance. Victor said that no employer in this city would hire a man who had created this kind of file for himself. He said it all in the measured, even tone he had used in the 14th floor office, and Ethan listened and said nothing and waited. Outside the conference room windows, the sky was clear after last night's rain, the kind of thin autumn clarity that is beautiful in a way that feels specifically uninvested in human problems. The building's lobby, 4 floors below, was visible through the interior glass that ran the length of the hallway. And then, in the lobby, something changed. A line of black vehicles had stopped at the entrance. Not 1, 4, arranged with the unhurried precision of an arrival that has been planned, that is happening on schedule. That is the kind of arrival that other arrivals have been arranged around. The lobby security desk was suddenly active with the particular kind of activity that meant people had been contacted in advance. A building manager in a suit that Ethan had never seen before appeared from a back corridor and moved to the entrance with the rapid, careful walk of someone trying to look composed while feeling the opposite. Victor Hale, who had been building to a second statement about Ethan's professional future, stopped. He was watching the lobby too, through the glass, with an expression that had shifted, for the first time in Ethan's experience of him, into something that contained uncertainty. She walked in with the kind of quiet that is louder than noise. 2 people flanked her, a man and a woman, both carrying bags and folders and the general equipment of people whose job is to make sure their principal has what she needs when she needs it. Several more individuals distributed themselves in the lobby, with the professional efficiency of a security team that had done this in harder environments than a logistics company's reception area. She wore gray. Her left wrist was wrapped in a medical brace that was clean and new. Above her right eyebrow, barely visible under makeup that had been applied with skill, was the edge of a bandage strip. She spoke to the building manager for approximately 30 seconds. Then she moved toward the elevator. The conference room floor. Victor Hale had been informed somehow a phone call or a message from the lobby, and his uncertainty had organized itself into performance. His jacket straightened, his expression calibrated to welcoming surprise. He was already stepping toward the hallway when she appeared at the conference room door, and the first thing she did was not look at Victor Hale. The first thing she did was look at the man seated at the conference table. She looked at Ethan Carter with the same quality of clear, present attention he had seen on her face in the rain and the orange light behind a highway barrier, and she said, "It's you," not a question, the recognition of something that had been anticipated. Her name was Elena Vaughn. The people in the room, who did not already know this name, registered it in the way that certain names register not a single moment of shock, but a sequence of small recalibrations, each one slightly larger than the last, as the full architecture of what the name meant assembled itself. Elena Vaughn, whose family office had built a fortune across 3 generations in international commodities and infrastructure financing. Elena Vaughn, who had spent the previous decade turning that inherited capital into something substantially larger through a series of acquisitions that had, in several notable cases, been described in financial press as unexpectedly aggressive. Elena Vaughn, who sat on the boards of 4 publicly traded companies and whose funds portfolio was, by recent estimates, valued at somewhere between $4 and $5 billion. She was 35 years old. She had survived a rollover accident on a rain-slicked highway the previous evening. She was standing in the doorway of a Meridian Logistics conference room looking at a man in a visitor's badge with an expression that contained something that was not routine. Victor Hale introduced himself. He extended his hand. Elena Vaughn shook it with the polite efficiency of someone completing a necessary formality on the way to what actually matters. She asked him to explain why Ethan Carter was in this room today. Victor said that this was an internal personnel matter, and that he would be delighted to discuss the company's overall operational direction with her at her convenience. Elena asked again, in the same even tone, why the man who had pulled her from a burning vehicle the previous night was being asked to sign a document in a conference room. Victor said, with the kind of careful verbal footwork that had served him well in many rooms, that Mr. Carter's separation from the company was regrettable, but had preceded last night's events and was unrelated to them. Elena said that she understood that. She said she was asking about the document on the table in front of Mr. Carter, not about the separation itself. Victor recalibrated. He said the document was standard procedure. Elena's attorney, a compact, alert woman, who had entered the room behind Elena without Ethan noticing, picked up the document and read one paragraph. She set it down. She said 2 words to Elena in a low voice. Elena nodded. She looked at Victor Hale and said that she had spent the morning reviewing Meridian Logistics' publicly available financials and that she had found them interesting. She said that her fund had, as of that morning, acquired a controlling interest in the company's majority shareholder through a series of transactions that had been in preparation for several weeks and that had accelerated following certain events of the previous evening. She said that this meant the board composition was going to change in the near term, and that she expected those changes to be reflected in the company's operational leadership. She said all of this in the tone of someone reading minutes from a previous meeting, factual, sequential, complete. The room's temperature changed, not the air temperature, the other kind. Victor Hale's face underwent a sequence of adjustments that took approximately 4 seconds and ended somewhere that was not composure. He said that this was, he said the acquisition would be subject to, he said, there were protocols. Elena's attorney mentioned, without raising her voice, 3 specific regulatory filings that had already been completed and timestamped that morning. Patrick from HR had quietly closed his folder and pushed his chair back from the table by several inches. Victor looked at Ethan, and for a moment Ethan could see that Victor was trying to determine whether Ethan had somehow engineered this, which was both absurd and revealing of how Victor understood the world, which was as a place where everything that happened to you was something that someone had done to you. Ethan looked back at him steadily and said nothing. Elena requested that the building's conference room on the 14th floor be made available for a board-level meeting within the hour. Ethan had carried the safety reports in his personal email for 11 months, not because he had planned to use them as leverage, but because he was an engineer who documented things as a reflex, who understood that data was the only argument that outlasted the person making it. Elena had asked, quietly and specifically, to see them. She had asked this while Victor Hale was not in the room, which had the quality of a precision rather than a coincidence. Ethan sent the files from his phone, and Elena's attorney opened them on a tablet. And the 3 of them, Ethan, Elena, and the attorney sat in a smaller room off the main conference area and went through them without drama, the way professionals review evidence. Methodically, without performance, following the logic where it led. The logic led to a batch of sourcing decisions made over a 14-month period, all of them traceable to a procurement override that had been signed, each time, by Victor Hale or by his designated deputy. The couplings were one item in a pattern. There were others. Pressure valves rated for loads they were being asked to exceed. Conveyor motors running outside their designed thermal range. A documented incident in the Eastern warehouse 8 months ago, in which a conveyor section had failed under load, and 3 workers had been within 5 meters of the collapse. That incident had been recorded internally as a minor equipment fault. 2 of the workers who had been present had subsequently left the company, which could mean anything, but which meant something specific in the context of the other documents. Dana, the engineer who had warned Ethan against submitting his report, appeared in the conference room doorway before the meeting had been formally called. She looked at Ethan and then at Elena, and she sat down. And she said she had her own files, which she had kept on a personal drive because she had not known what else to do with them. More people came. Not in a rush, there was no theatrical moment of solidarity. No cinematic gathering of the wronged. They came the way people come when they understand that something real is happening and that they have information relevant to it, and that the conditions that had made using that information dangerous might be shifting. A warehouse supervisor named Greg, who had filed 2 internal complaints that disappeared into the system. A junior safety coordinator who had been quietly moved to a non-essential role after raising a concern. By mid-afternoon, there were 7 of them, and the documents on the table represented a comprehensive account of a company being systematically stripped for short-term margin, while its workers absorbed the risk of the stripping. Victor Hale had been in the 14th floor conference room, which he still appeared to believe was his conference room, for 3 hours. His attorney had arrived. His attorney had reviewed the same documents. Victor's attorney was a man who had spent decades defending positions that deserved defending and positions that did not, and his expression throughout the afternoon had the quality of someone doing arithmetic that keeps coming out wrong. At 4:15, the board convened via video. The independent directors who had been reached by Elena's team over the course of the day, people who had been selected for their positions because they were supposed to represent stakeholder interests and who were now being presented with documentation that raised questions about what they had been representing instead. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Victor made his case with the fluency and confidence of a man who had made cases in boardrooms many times and who understood that conviction and the appearance of conviction were frequently interchangeable, and who had generally found that understanding sufficient. He said that Ethan Carter was a disgruntled former employee pursuing a personal agenda. He said that Elena Vaughn was making a business decision that had been emotionally influenced by an unrelated personal experience. He said both of these things in the measured tone, and the board listened, and then the board asked the attorney to present the financial audit summary that Elena's team had prepared, which showed that Meridian's maintenance budget over the previous 14 months contained a systematic discrepancy between allocated and dispersed funds, with the difference traceable to a vendor account that turned out to be registered to a holding company with one beneficial owner. Victor Hale did not raise his voice during the meeting itself. He raised it afterward, in the hallway outside the boardroom, when the decision had been communicated and it had become clear that the performance of control was no longer sustainable. He said things about loyalty, about being built this company, which was not true. He had arrived 18 months ago about people who did not understand what leadership required. He said that the board was making a mistake driven by sentiment and that in 6 months they would understand what they had lost. He said these things to no one in particular, because the people in the hallway had arranged themselves at a distance from him that communicated, without words, that his claims on their attention had expired. There was a moment, just before the security team arrived, when he looked across the hallway, and his eyes found Ethan's, and in that moment something passed between them that was not triumph, and not pity, and not quite satisfaction. It was closer to recognition. The acknowledgement between two people in the same hallway of how they arrived at opposite positions in it, and what those positions said about the choices that had led here. Then the security team arrived, and the moment closed. The security team that arrived was professional and quiet. One of them was Marcus, from the lobby desk, who had walked Ethan to the elevator the previous morning. Marcus did not look directly at Victor as he escorted him toward the exit. This was not cruelty. It was the basic, reflexive mercy of someone in a difficult position doing their job. She found him in the building's lower atrium, where he had gone because it was quieter, sitting with a cup of coffee that the lobby cafe had produced without being asked, as if the building itself understood that something had shifted and was attempting, in a small way, to compensate. Elena Vaughn sat across from him with the deliberateness of someone who has scheduled this conversation in their head while finishing the previous ones. She said she had looked into him after she woke up in the hospital, which she said had been her first coherent act upon regaining full consciousness. Asking the nurse to contact her chief of staff, and asking her chief of staff to find out who had been at the accident scene the previous night. She said that what she had found had been unexpected, and that unexpected was not a word she used casually, because she dealt professionally in the unexpected, and had developed a fairly high threshold for it. What she had found was that the man who had pulled her through a car window had, several hours earlier, been walked out of his job for reporting safety violations. She said she had a particular relationship with stories of that shape. Her father had died when she was 22, in an accident at a manufacturing facility that an internal review had subsequently found was operating equipment that maintenance reports had flagged as unsafe for the 18 months preceding the accident. The review had been conducted by the same company that owned the facility. The review had found no actionable negligence. Her father had been 51 years old and had laughed easily, and had called her every Sunday morning without exception for as long as she could remember, and the Sunday after the accident had been the first Sunday in her adult life that the phone did not ring at 9 in the morning, and she had sat in her apartment in the thin Sunday quiet and understood, in the way you understand things that change the fundamental equation of who you are, that the silence was going to be permanent. Elena had spent the following decade acquiring the financial means to ensure that she never again found herself in a position of being on the wrong side of that kind of review. She said this without self-pity or performance. She said it the way Ethan had read the safety reports. Here is what happened. Here is what it means. She asked him why he had helped her. Not why he had acted. She understood impulse, she said. She understood that some people move toward situations that others move away from. She was asking why. Specifically, after the day he had experienced, on a highway in the rain, on his way home from the worst professional moment of his life. He had stopped and done what he had done. Ethan thought about this for a moment with the genuine attention of a person who doesn't answer questions before he understands them. Then he said that leaving her there had not been an option that was available to him, not because of obligation or calculation, but because of what he was. He said, "The kind of man who doesn't stop is not who I am." Elena was quiet for a moment. She looked at her coffee cup. Then she looked at him. She said, "I know. That's why I'm here." She offered him the position of Chief Operating Officer of Meridian Logistics. She said it directly, without preamble, which Ethan was beginning to understand was how she said everything that mattered. He looked at her for a moment and said that he was a maintenance engineer. She said yes, she knew that. She said that what the company needed, in her assessment, was someone who understood what the machines actually did and what happened when they were pushed past their limits, and someone whose instinct, when something was wrong, was to say so rather than to calculate the personal cost of saying so. She said she had considered other candidates, and that none of them had that combination, and that the combination was not something that could be assembled from credentials. Ethan said that running an operation of this size was a different thing from knowing how to fix it. Elena said that he would not be doing it alone, that she was installing a management team around him, that her function in the near term was going to be close oversight, and that what she needed from him specifically was the thing that could not be hired for, the standing in this building, among these workers, that came from being the person who had told the truth when telling it was costly and had been correct. He said he needed to think. She said she expected that, and that she would be in the building for the next 2 days. He said he appreciated it. Then he left, and she sat for a while longer in the atrium with her coffee, and she looked at the building around her, the lobby traffic, the elevator doors opening and closing, the ordinary motion of a workday continuing in the aftermath of a disruption, and she thought about her father, the way she sometimes allowed herself to think about him when the circumstances were appropriate. Not with grief, which served nothing, but with the specific, purposeful attention of someone who has decided that a particular story is going to mean something. Ethan drove home. His daughter, Mia, was 16 and perceptive in the way that children of single parents sometimes become perceptive, attuned to the frequency of a parent's mood, practiced at reading the information in small things. She was at the kitchen table doing homework when he came in, and she looked at him for a moment, with the particular quality of attention that meant she was running her internal assessment, and then she said, "Good day or bad day?" He sat down across from her and thought about it. He said, "Both." In that order. She nodded. The way she nodded, when she was filing information rather than responding to it. And she went back to her homework. And he made dinner, and the evening had the ordinary, restorative texture of routine, the sounds of a house where people live, dishes, a television in the other room, the particular silence of his daughter reading, which was a companionable silence, full rather than empty. He did not tell her about the offer yet. He wanted to sit with it first. He wanted to understand what he was saying yes to before he said it. Later, when she had gone to bed and the house was quiet, he sat at the kitchen table with the lamp on and the old commendation plaque in front of him, the one with the bent corners, and he read what was written on it. Employee of the Year. 14 years ago, the year he had started, he put it back in the box and closed the lid and left it on the counter, and he went to bed, and he slept better than he had in months, which surprised him, because nothing had been resolved yet. He would understand later that what he had been sleeping through was not resolution, but decision. The body knowing before the mind admits it what the person is going to do. He called Elena the next morning and said he would take the position on 2 conditions. The first was that the safety reporting structure would be independent of operations management, reporting directly to the board, and that this would be formalized in the company's governance documents rather than left as a policy preference. The second was that the workers who had been present at the Eastern Warehouse incident 8 months ago and who had subsequently left the company would be contacted, and that if their departure had been coerced or incentivized in exchange for silence, the company would make that right. Elena said both conditions were reasonable, and that the first one had already been on her list. She said she would handle the second one personally. Ethan said he would start Monday. The Monday he walked into the building as its chief operating officer was a different kind of Monday from the Thursday he had walked out of it with a cardboard box. He did not make a speech. He did not call an all-hands meeting or send a company-wide email with bullet points about his vision and values. He went to the maintenance bay, which was where he knew what he was looking at, and he spent the first 3 hours of his tenure as COO doing what he had always done, walking the floor, looking at the machines, talking to the people who ran them. He asked questions. He took notes on his phone. He found 3 issues within the first hour that had been on maintenance request logs for between 6 and 11 weeks without resolution. And he called the relevant teams and asked what was needed to close them, and he made the calls that morning to get the parts ordered. The floor workers watched him with the particular quality of attention that a person receives when they have been the subject of institutional narrative and are now present in the flesh, something between wariness and hope, which resolved, as the morning continued, in the direction of hope. The first full staff meeting he ran was the following Wednesday. He sat at the head of the table and said that he was going to tell them 3 things. He said, the first thing was that the component sourcing decisions of the past 14 months were being reversed, and that all equipment would be brought back into specification over the following 60 days, with a timeline and budget that he had already reviewed with Elena's team. He said the second thing was that the ethics reporting channel was being restructured, and that any person in the building who had filed a report in the past 2 years and received no response or a dismissive one should submit it again would receive a substantive reply within 5 business days from him. He said the third thing was that the standard for decision-making going forward in this company was going to be simple and consistent. If it is not safe and it is not honest, it does not happen. He said this without drama or grandiosity, in the flat, factual tone of someone establishing a technical specification. He also said one more thing, which was not on any prepared list, that every person in the room who had known something was wrong and had said nothing not out of cowardice, but out of the reasonable calculation that saying something was dangerous was not being judged for that silence. He said that the conditions that had made silence rational were being removed, and that going forward, the expectation was speech, and that his door on the 7th floor was not a metaphorical door. The room was quiet when he finished. Then Greg, the warehouse supervisor, who was sitting 3 seats down on the left, said, "About time." A few people laughed. The specific laugh of relief. Victor Hale watched the company's public announcement from his apartment on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the board meeting. The announcement was a regulatory filing, technically, but it had been covered by 3 business publications and was on the front page of the financial section of 2 major newspapers. The headline in one of them read, "Meridian Logistics Overhauls Leadership After Safety Scandal." The piece quoted Elena Vaughn, describing the new operational philosophy. It quoted an industry analyst who said the restructuring was notable for its speed and comprehensiveness. It did not quote Victor Hale. Because Victor Hale had signed a separation agreement, and because the agreement, unlike the one he had tried to get Ethan to sign, contained terms that reflected the actual distribution of responsibility. Victor turned off the television and sat in the apartment for a while, in the particular silence of a space that is furnished but not inhabited chairs and surfaces, and a window with a view, but nothing that belonged to a life being built rather than stored. He thought about the things he would have done differently. He thought about them in the way that men like Victor think about lost positions, which was less as moral reflection and more as strategic analysis, looking for the miscalculation rather than the wrong. He did not find the thing he was looking for, because the thing he was looking for was not the kind of thing that exists in strategic analysis. It exists somewhere else. He had never learned its name. Ethan kept the old employee badge. He put it in the top drawer of his desk in the office on the 7th floor, not the 14th. He had chosen the 7th, which was where the people who actually ran things worked, and he kept it not as a trophy or a reminder of injury but as a reference point, the way an engineer keeps a sample of a failed part, so that the failure has a physical presence, so that it cannot be abstracted into something that feels safe to forget. The badge said his name and his department, and had a photo of him taken during his 2nd year at the company, a version of himself 14 years younger, who did not know yet what the building on the badge would cost him or give him, and who looked, in the photo, with the particular expression of someone who has just started somewhere and is paying attention. Elena was in the Eastern warehouse on a Friday afternoon, 3 months into the restructuring, watching the new conveyor system run its first full-load cycle. The couplings were the correct couplings. The pressure readings were inside specification. The floor supervisor was a woman who had transferred from another facility and who had been briefed, thoroughly, on the history of the Eastern warehouse and what that history meant for how the facility was going to be run going forward. Elena watched the system run for a few minutes without saying anything. Then she said, mostly to herself, "Maybe for the first time this place belongs to the right people." Ethan was standing a few feet away. He said, "Not to the right people, to the people who didn't quit on it." Elena considered this. She said, "Is there a difference?" He said, "Yes. One of those you get assigned. The other one you earn." She looked at him for a moment with the same quality of attention she had brought to every significant conversation since the one in the hospital room when she had asked who had been at the accident and had begun the sequence of events that had led here to a warehouse floor in the thin afternoon light, to a company that was attempting, with imperfect human materials, to be what it had always claimed on paper to be. She did not respond to what he said. She did not need to. The machines were running correctly. The numbers on the monitoring panels were inside their ranges. Somewhere in the building, in a drawer, was a badge with a man's name on it and a photo of him paying attention. On the wall of the lobby, installed by a sign company on a Tuesday morning while the early shift was coming in plain letters on a white background that anyone entering the building could read without having to look for it, were 3 words: integrity before profit. Not a slogan, exactly. A specification. The kind that means something because the person who wrote it down had already decided to be held to it. Before anyone else was watching, on a rainy highway, in the dark, with nothing to gain and no reason except that it was the right thing, and he was the person who was there.